Hi, hello, I'm Carby Anderson-Tufnell from Madison HR. Madison HR are a HR consultancy that support SMEs with everything people related, whether that's disciplinaries, grievances, training and appraisals. And as an organisation, we're very much still on our diversity and inclusion journey. We're still wanting to learn more, find out more. And so to increase our knowledge and awareness in the area, we have arranged a series of interviews with industry experts and people that are very passionate about the topic. And so I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Ellie Highwood from Equasense. Ellie is a diversity and inclusion specialist, as well as an accredited facilitator, and you work very closely with HR leadership teams to devise and review strategies on diversity and also putting together action plans. First of all, thanks for your time today, Ellie. Obviously, you and we met at a networking event and I heard you speak about diversity and I found it such an engaging talk, which is why we're here today, and I wanted to invite you to have this chat. So yeah, I have a few questions for you. Are you ready to make a start?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's always good to talk about diversity and inclusion. The more conversations we have about it, the better. So yeah, ready whenever you are.
Thank you, Ellie. So I guess first of all, I've given a brief introduction to you, but can you tell us a bit about yourself and your area of expertise?
Yeah, so I've had a bit of an unconventional journey into diversity and inclusion. So I spent 26 years working at a university as a research professor. I did a physics undergraduate degree, so I've had a long interest in women in science and engineering because it's still a place where women are underrepresented. And that kind of long-term interest, as well as seeing different opportunities for people with different backgrounds throughout schools and universities, led me to get more interested in diversity and inclusion. So I spent 4 years leading the university strategy for diversity and inclusion for the University of Reading. And then just over a year ago, I decided that it would be great to be able to work with a more diverse set of organisations. So now I'm self-employed as a diversity and inclusion consultant, and I work with teams large and small, thinking about either their existing diversity and inclusion strategy, how to talk about it, how to develop a new one, and I also do some training, introductions and unconscious bias training.
Okay.
So yeah, it's now my full-time job.
Wow, so you yourself have a very diverse career, physics to diversity. Wow. And we talked about, we mentioned earlier about how we should be having these conversations. Why would you say diversity and inclusion is important?
So obviously there's a lot of attention on diversity and inclusion, and specifically on racism at the moment, and I think that's entirely appropriate. If I have to say, explain to people why I think diversity and inclusion is important, there's lots of reasons that people give. My reasons might be that, we live in a very complex world. The chances are that we're going to need all viewpoints and as much talent as possible to be able to find the solutions that we need in that complex, uncertain and changing world. And therefore we want, diversity of thought, diversity of experience. There's plenty of examples of things that have been developed using only information from small groups of people or small sets of data that where it could have gone better. So a lot of the artificial intelligence type work, facial recognition has been trained on data sets that are not diverse and doesn't recognize people of color in the way that it should be recognized, for example. So we have evidence that not having this diversity of thought and experience and what we think of in terms of protected characteristics under the legal framework is just one set of those. So things like race and gender, but neurodiversity, diversity of socioeconomic background, things that aren't protected under law, are also really important. So I would say it's a complex world full of diverse people and diverse problems. We need to bring the maximum amount of expertise and understanding to those roles and to solve those issues. And if we don't, then we're only going to have a partial solution at best. In the workplace, there's other contexts. So it has been demonstrated through research that McKinsey and people have done that, if you have a more diverse board, tend to be more successful financially. So, for some people that gives a driver for doing diversity and inclusion. Also, people worry about engaging their workforce and having a happy, productive workforce, and making people feel included and belong is an important contributor to that. So there's all sorts of reasons why we should have diversity and inclusion as a firm part of our business as usual priorities.
Okay, yeah, I think there is talk, like you say, of people saying it gives you that competitive edge, and also people's priorities have changed, like work-life balance, and I guess even the pandemic has opened people's eyes in terms of flexible working, etc. So yes, that makes sense. And obviously, one of the terms we talked about, mentioned earlier, was unconscious bias. What is unconscious bias?
So yeah, it's something that you hear a lot about. It's where you have an influence that you're not aware of leads you to make assumptions about someone or about a particular circumstances, and it can influence your decisions. It's actually a product of a useful shortcut process in your brain, because if we had to make a conscious, logical decision for every single thing that we did during a day, we wouldn't be able to cope. So we don't generally go through a conscious step-by-step decision-making plan when, for example, we see a red traffic light and we need to know what to do. Our brain has met that pattern before. It uses that pattern recognition and says, oh, okay, it's a red light, I need to stop. And we do that unconsciously. It's when that kind of shortcut has been influenced by stereotypes or experiences or cultural, societal experiences, that means we form a bias that we're not aware of, that influences our decisions. Now, as soon as you become aware of it, it's then a conscious bias. That doesn't mean it's easier to deal with, but awareness is the first step. And everybody has some form of unconscious bias, but it does influence decisions, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's just okay because everyone's got it. It doesn't mean we don't have to work against them. Okay,
and so taking that a step further, how do we actually determine what our own unconscious biases are? Because everyone's going to have different ones, as you say, and how do we address them?
So it's really interesting. So there are some ways where you can sort of take more formal tests or exercises to try and determine what your unconscious bias is. One that you might hear a lot is called the Harvard Implicit Association Test, or the IAT. This is a computer-based test run out of Harvard University in the US. It's a long-term research project, and it basically tests how quickly your brain combines different things. So one test might be positive words with women and negative words with men, or vice versa. There's some controversy about whether it actually reveals a bias, but I have used it with people to just start a conversation. And there are versions to do with race and skin color, there's versions to do with body shape, there's versions to do with gender and gender stereotypes about home versus career. So that can be a way of doing it. A slightly less techie version is if you're asking, what can I do? That tells me that you're already aware that these things exist. Yeah. And therefore, sometimes what you can do is take an audit. Just audit yourself. So there's two ways of doing this. Firstly, you can use the 10 most trusted exercise. So this is where you would write down on a piece of paper the 10 people that you trust most in terms of giving you advice. It can be business, home, combination. And then you look at what gender are they? How old are they? What ethnic background do they come from? And most people will end up with quite a narrow range of answers to those questions. And that's natural.
I just saying that I can think of it myself, yeah.
And mine is the same. You naturally surround yourself with people with similarities to you, and that's fine. But if you want to be more aware of how that could be influencing your decisions, then maybe it's time to, have a think about broadening your network a bit. And it could be as much as, following different people on LinkedIn or Twitter or Instagram. It could be listening to a different podcast, watching something different on television with a different viewpoint, and just start kind of broadening your experience and your circles a bit. You can also do it just by doing an audit of those things. Who do I listen to? Who do I watch? Is it all the same? Is it time to choose, something a bit more out of the box? So choose a different fiction author, for example, a novel by a person of colour.
Yeah.
So from my background, that would be something that I might not have done, but there is a lot of literature out there that I've missed out on, and I'm trying to catch up with that right now.
And that's really useful. That actually sounds like good homework to be given. So,
Yes.
And I know there's different types of unconscious biases. Could you outline some examples?
Yeah, so I saw an infographic actually earlier this week that said something about 150 different types of bias, which is way overwhelming.
Yeah.
So I think the ones that I think influence our decisions most, where they then affect how we interact with other people, are things like similarity bias. So we might be more tempted to listen to or take advice or recruit someone who shares something in common with us. That might be the school that we went to. It might be a subject that we've studied. If people put their interests on CVs and application forms, it might be that we both like walking or, whatever it is, American football, I don't know. So there's something that's a similarity that's not necessarily relevant to how that person would do the role you're recruiting them for, or how they would behave on an everyday basis. So similarity is a common one. There's a related one, which is either the halo or the horns effect. And this can be where you pick on one thing that you really like about that person, and that leads you to gloss over everything else. So they might have done one really amazing thing. In my own previous world, that might be that a scientist had won a prize, for example, for their research. But then you would overlook the fact that they didn't have a very good teaching record, or their subject didn't really fit with the university or whatever. So then it's that kind of halo effect, putting a magic glow over the whole of their CV or whatever. And the opposite is horns. So you see one thing that you don't like, and then you forget all the good things that would make them the person. It's just that really tiny little thing that really tickles you.
Yeah.
And so you've got to kind of avoid that. And confirmation bias is something we're all pretty guilty of most of the time. So we will look for evidence to support our view. So I think those are probably the key ones. There are many more, but those are ones I come across all the time. No, and I know that I'm guilty of sometimes too.
Yeah, I mean, those are key ones. I can't believe there's over 150. Wow. So would you say that all stereotypes are bad?
That's a really, really interesting question. And that's prompted me to do quite a lot of thinking again about this over the weekend since we last talked. So I think stereotypes can be useful as long as you are aware that that's what they are. And you don't then allow them to affect the decisions about people. So, for example, it might be useful to know that generally more boys play football and more girls play netball, but to then decide you're only going to offer football to boys and netball to girls becomes a bias or a discrimination. And that's where the stereotype stops becoming useful and becomes a bias. Another example might be you might have experience that lots of people from a certain university have skills that are useful for, a specific profession, maybe law. But to then only recruit and target that particular university would be to be allowing that stereotype to be affecting how you miss out on people from everywhere else. So I think stereotypes can be helpful, but only if you are aware of their limitations and that that's what they are. And to refer to someone by their stereotypical characteristics is probably a disrespectful thing to do.
Okay, no, thank you.
Phrases that are banned in my house, things like that, man up is banned in my house. I have a house full of boys actually, but man up is banned as a phrase. And I hate people saying, cry like a girl, things like that. No.
They just become so common in our daily language, and it is a case of just addressing them, saying, actually, no, let's stop. Okay. I'm glad I challenged you with that question and got you thinking over the weekend.
I love to be challenged. Because we only learn by challenging and asking ourselves those questions and challenging ourselves. And actually a lot of, when you're thinking about your own biases, you will feel uncomfortable, and that's okay. And it's good to feel to challenge yourself every now and then. And if you're not, then you're probably not getting to something really underlying it. So thank you for that question.
Okay, great. And so another term that's been heard a lot is the word privilege. What does it refer to in sort of a diversity and inclusion context?
Yeah, so we've heard a lot about this over the summer, particularly in the context of white privilege, but it's a bit broader than that. So I suppose how I would describe it in this context is it's a bit like having a toolbox gifted to you that contains things that allow you to access opportunities that people who don't have that toolbox and toolkit can't get. And you did nothing to get that toolkit. It was just gifted to you. And it, so I have, it's nothing to do necessarily with how much money you have, or the social class that you're in, if you still, if you live in a class framework, which, let's be honest, we might like to think we don't, but it's still there in the UK. It's things that you haven't done, but that give you an advantage without you really being aware of it until you stop to think about it. So I have privilege in a lot of areas. So I'm white. I come from a traditional nuclear family. I am middle class. I am heterosexual, and all of those things give me opportunities because of the way the world works that somebody who didn't have those forms of privilege wouldn't have. It doesn't mean that I haven't had difficulties in my life at certain points. It doesn't mean that I haven't worked hard to get where I am and do what I do. It just means that I do have this invisible kind of toolkit that opens doors for me that it might not for other people. And that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Thank you. Makes a lot of sense, actually. So what advice would you give to people wanting to unlearn unconscious bias? I know you mentioned, asking the questions, having the conversations. Is there any other tips?
So honestly, I think being aware is the first step. And I think, if I'm totally honest, I know that I have conscious biases as well as unconscious biases.
Yes, I do. Yeah.
And it is about challenging yourself to address those. It's also about, you might not be able to unlearn your unconscious bias totally, but there's this thing about, if you know that you have some form of bias, or if you know about when unconscious bias is likely to kick in, then you can avoid situations where you let it rule your decisions. So for example, unconscious bias is more likely to influence your decisions if you are making decisions when you are tired or stressed, and this is highly relevant to today's world. If you are either very close to a decision or a long way away from a decision. So if it doesn't directly influence you and it's a decision about people a long way away from you, then your biases may be more likely to kick in. So it's about this kind of interaction between awareness of your own biases, and then if you have control over how things work, making situations where it's less likely that those things happen. So if you're doing a whole day of interviews, for example, don't make the decision at the end of the day that you've done all the interviews, because you will be tired. Yeah. You will be biased by various things. It's better to then go and reflect, and this is something that you will know really well, but it's just simple things like that. So when I work with my clients, it's about working on the individual, and then also making sure that the situations those people are making decisions in are supportive of bias having less of an influence, if you see what I mean. It's kind of a partnership thing. But really, for the individual, awareness is the first thing.
Yeah. It's so true about the interview thing, especially in HR doing interviews. By the end of it, by that last person, it just affects your judgment, the tiredness that, you know, you don't realize how mentally exhausting it can be. And so it is just taking a step back and thinking about it overnight. You know,
Yeah, and there is this, you know, you want to get that thing done.
yes.
So you want to get it done. You also want to get back to candidates and things like that. And I understand that people want to hear, but actually it's probably better from a, you know, and how we understand bias to work with our brains to kind of stop and pause. And also things like making sure you have structured interviews and that you know, you do things the same for everyone. So the standard recruitment type stuff really, but you can apply that framework to other contexts as well.
Brilliant. And on to my last question. Are there any recommended resources for people wanting to increase their awareness on this topic?
Yeah, well, so I think many people who are interested in this subject will have seen, you know, reading list after reading list come out over the summer, particularly focusing on race and white privilege. And there's many good things out there on that. In terms of unconscious bias, there's a really good little 3-minute video done by the Royal Society. So if you Google Royal Society, you'll find a little video which tells you about it. And that's quite useful actually for putting, if you've got a meeting where you have to make a big decision, it's quite useful just to run that at the start of the meeting, and that just puts people in that frame of mind. So that's a really sort of day-to-day reminder of what you can do. But as I've said, the other things, there's a book by June Sarpong that I'm reading at the moment, which is called Diversify, and that talks about how certain groups become the other group, and it has little reflection questions at the end of each chapter, or discussion questions if you have a group of people that are interested in doing this together. So my best recommendation is always the last thing I've read, because there is just so much out there. But it's that doing that 10 most trusted thing as a resource. Have a look at the Harvard IAT. Some people like it, some people don't, and that's fine. It's about starting a conversation. And otherwise there are you know, really good resources out there from the Royal Society and other places like that.
Great. And is it true that you have a newsletter you can sign up to on your website?
Yes, that's true. So if you go to www.equasense.co.uk and sign up, then you can get a newsletter once a month with things that I've seen, you know, links to webinars or summaries of webinars that I've been to, new books that have come out, all that kind of thing. So you'll also find information there on the Consciously Inclusive, which is my unconscious bias training program. It's not just a workshop, it's kind of a development program, so it's a bit different. And you can also contact me to find out information about that. But yeah, I'm more than happy to drop tips and hints into your inboxes once a month.
No, brilliant. It's on my to-do list today to sign up to the newsletter. Yeah, that was the last question. Thank you so much, Ellie. Yeah,
you're welcome.